Hey everybody, hope you're having a good day so far. What we're going to be going over now is a touch of Rails, and we're going to be basically getting into our first actual dynamic content. Now, Rails is kind of an interesting one because for me, it's not one that I have commonly used when I've done anything with the web. Just a bit of background, I probably have mentioned it before. I tend to fall on the PHP side of dynamic web content. That's something that we will be getting a touch of next week as well. But this is kind of a nice starter point because it gets us into that whole model view controller paradigm, which is going to become very, very common for you, especially as we get into things like React and other technologies like that. So, without further ado, let's flip over here and we're going to talk a bit about Rails. Now, Rails is a server-based system where, again, I mentioned model view controller. We'll talk about that pretty soon, but it's based around a couple of things. So one, it uses the Ruby language, which is really not that hard. I'll give you a little bit of a, kind of get up and running with Ruby type of small assignment to get used to it. We're not going to spend a ton of time in Ruby, and Rails will do a little bit, but we're mainly going to be moving over to React pretty soon after this. But I wanted you to get a taste of it so that you can at least, appreciate what it does. Um, but what this is going to get us is, again, a dynamic web application. The other side is that Rails has an interesting kind of paradigm behind it, which we'll get into momentarily. But just to give you another perspective, so I've shown you this image before in terms of straight up HTTP, right? With dynamic services, though, the thing that we're going to be trying to figure out here is that, yes, we have a client and that's running, from the HTML perspective, but we're getting information from the server dynamically. And let me give you an example. You visit a website where there's a blog running, or it's a shopping type of application like an Amazon or some kind of storefront. And everything on the homepage or everything on your profile is dynamically generated from a database. This is not something where somebody manually hand coded an HTML page. They have basically like a template, and whatever's inside the particular field is being filled in by a database or by some kind of a asynchronous call or something. But basically, it's being, again, dynamically generated. And there are a number of technologies that are out there that will get us that, Ruby on Rails being one of them. There's also PHP, there's various flavors of .NET. React will be getting into that as well a little bit later in the semester. But the idea here is that the server is sending data to the client. It's not just rendering a static HTML page. So why this figure is here again, we're focusing on the server side now. And with Ruby and Ruby on Rails, this is basically going to be an application running on your web servers. So for the first assignment where you get up and running with Rails, I'm actually going to have you create a brand new instance, and we'll talk about why momentarily. But you're going to be dynamically serving content, and it's really not all that tricky. It's just involves configuring and getting things up and running. So to give you a touch of history here, Rails started out in 2003, was not open source for quite some time. Then 2014 rolls around, it becomes open source, meaning that it's no longer licensed. You don't have to pay to use it. Anybody can install Rails on their server and use it. And it's a very nice architecture. There's a lot of, kind of interesting principles behind it. Again, we'll get to that momentarily. But there were three ideas here. So one, let's use Ruby. Now, Ruby is kind of, at least to me, a Python competitor. It's focused around ease of use and not being syntactically crazy. But, Ruby's one of the bases there. Another thing is that it's going to follow MVC, which is a model view architecture, model view controller architecture paradigm. I've got a snippet of that in another slide or two to show you how that all works. As a spoiler, this is a very, very common architecture on the web or even in mobile applications. And the third one, let's maximize programmer happiness. This is where the interesting and my eyes roll slightly. So let's address the last one first. I'm not going to go through these because as a cantankerous not fully caffeinated person, I see these kinds of things and think, okay, somebody had too much time on their hands, but they strongly believe in this, which, is something that you can get behind. The idea basically is that you want your language to be good for programmers and that it's not going to cause them unnecessary consternation. So basically, there's a lot of kind of guiding principles to the language, which is fine. It's not for me, but it's fine. So and I'll let you read through that on your own, basically. Other things to talk about before we get into MVC, who uses it? Because that's always a good question to ask when you're kind of evaluating a new technology. Is it even worth installing? Well, there are a lot of big technology companies that do use Rails. There's Shopify, Groupon, I've got it here on the screen in front of you, where these are all known to use Rails in some fashion. And, if big companies are using it, there's probably a reason behind why they're using it. So just take that into account. It's not like a one-off thing and it's a niche thing. It's a very common application. Other question, why Rails? Right? We have React, we have Angular, we have straight PHP. Use .NET, C# or an ASP.NET. Why would we use Rails? It's just another technology, right? Well, MVC, for one, is a really nice paradigm to learn. It's baked into the language, it's baked into the environment, and it's very, very mature. It has been around for a long time, meaning that there is a large community, there is a large set of documentation resources available, lots of forums, lots of experts out there, and basically it's good to have that when you're building a production application so that if you have questions, you can, turn to the internet and ask them, and you'll probably get an answer. And, like I said, Ruby's been around for a while, but a lot of big companies are still using it, so it's still a good thing, even in, 2022. Okay, so we're working backwards through why Rails. The first one was the architecture, that MVC. If you're familiar with MVC, that's great. If you've never heard of it before, it's basically just a design pattern in computing for how we kind of present information and get information to the user. Typically, in this figure we've got here, this is the MVC aspect of it. You basically are going to have a set of views, which is the screens that the user will see. Right? I might have a view for profile, a view for homepage, a view for, listing content or something like that. But basically, I'm going to have a set of views. I will have a model, which you see here. This is talking to our database or some kind of data store. Then you have a controller, which is kind of the glue between them. This routes the user to different views. It might tell the model where to get data from, parameters, things of that nature. Depending on your implementation of MVC, you might fully decouple things. There might be a little bit of tighter integration. The view and the model might talk to each other depending. There are some flexibilities with this particular paradigm. I'd highly recommend checking out. There's a great Wikipedia entry on MVC, just kind of laying out the particulars of it. But really, the idea is separation. So you want to separate out all these concerns. And why do we do that? Well, if I have a very complicated website, phone application, standard application, something like that, and I want to add a new screen, okay? Maybe I have a edit user page that I need to add. If I have a standard application, I'm probably going to have to update things in many, many, many different places, possibly retest, revalidate everything. But in MVC, I just add a new view, tell the controller where to find that view, tell the model how to populate that view, and ideally it's a very simple add or delete or edit. So the idea is, again, separation, and Rails comes with that by default, which is great. Now what you're seeing here in terms of the Rails architecture, here's our MVC aspect, but this is basically working on a server, right? So it's working on a web server. So here we have our Apache servers that you've all set up for, your first or second assignment, can't remember now. You're going to have a public folder, and then you could deploy Rails in there. The interesting thing that we're going to see is that we don't actually need Apache for Rails either. We can just run it as a local Rails application and off we go. So basically, Rails is populating the data for our site. We're going to have our applications defined within Rails. It's going to be served by the web server. The browser is going to get that data as, again, just an HTML page, but all of that data has been filled in by the server. All right. So I've got a little bit more of a detailed article here about MVC as well from somebody other than me or Wikipedia, but it's something that is absolutely worth learning. So the next videos are going to be getting Rails up and running, doing a little hello world, hello database world, and things of that nature. But until then, bye for now.